In the year 200 AD, Rome allocated a staggering 75% of its imperial budget towards military expenditure. The governmental debt was escalating at an alarming rate, while the currency itself was undergoing devaluation. Simultaneously, wealth inequality reached unprecedented historical levels, political institutions faltered, and protracted foreign conflicts depleted vital resources. Citizens, rather than demanding substantive reforms, clamored for sustenance and spectacle. Fast forward to America in the year 2025 AD. Military spending constitutes 54% of the discretionary budget, totaling over $1.5 trillion. Governmental debt stands at $36 trillion, and the currency has depreciated by 98% since 1913. Wealth inequality has surged to its highest point since 1929. Political institutions are characterized by perpetual gridlock and unending conflicts, while citizens now demand economic stimulus and readily available entertainment as substitutes for meaningful societal change. The parallels are evident to everyone. Rome experienced 250 years of gradual decline from its zenith to its eventual collapse. The prevailing sentiment is that America is presently traversing a comparable trajectory. This comparison is ubiquitous, appearing in books, documentaries, and articles. Are we, in essence, witnessing a replay of Rome? The potential downfall of the American empire looms large. However, there's a crucial aspect that most overlook. The comparison itself is not flawed. Rather, it is incomplete. The true narrative lies not in the similarities, but in the differences. And these differences do not portend our safety. They indicate an even greater peril. Each distinction between Rome and America serves to hasten, not decelerate, the process of collapse. Rome existed in a pre-industrial era. America, conversely, is a post-industrial nation. Rome benefited from 500 years of cultural homogeneity preceding its crisis. America, in contrast, has only existed for 250 years in total. Rome's financial obligations were largely internal. America's debt, however, is global in scope. The Roman elite possessed a vested interest in the empire's survival. The contemporary American elite, however, have established exit strategies. Rome possessed the capacity for territorial expansion as a means to resolve its internal issues. America, however, has no further frontiers to explore. The devaluation of Rome's currency was discernible in its silver content. America's currency devaluation, conversely, is obfuscated within invisible digital ledgers. Every divergence between the two nations intensifies the timeline towards collapse. Rome's decline from its apex to its ultimate fall spanned 250 years. America, however, has compressed a similar descent into a mere 54 years since 1971. Consequently, the subsequent phase of this decline will not unfold over another 2 centuries. It is likely to transpire within a maximum of 10 to 20 years. Let us examine every significant parallel between Rome and America. This analysis will illuminate why the comparison is valid, yet insufficient. We will delve into which specific differences are crucial and why they matter. Furthermore, we will explore how these distinctions accelerate, rather than avert, collapse. Crucially, understanding what sets us apart from Rome is more paramount than recognizing our commonalities. This is because anyone preparing for a Roman-style protracted collapse will be utterly blindsided when America's timeline compresses dramatically. Allow me to illustrate precisely what Rome can teach us. It is not that we are destined to repeat its fate, but rather that we are destined to repeat it at an exponentially faster pace. The Roman comparison is pervasive because the parallels are undeniable. I will now present the 7 principal parallels that lead everyone to proclaim, "We are Rome." Parallel 1. Military overextension. At its zenith in the year 7 AD, under Emperor Trajan, Rome commanded territories stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, and from the Rhine to the Sahara. This vast dominion necessitated the deployment of 30 legions, comprising approximately 300,000 soldiers. The core issue was not the sheer size of the military itself, but rather Rome's absolute reliance on this military to maintain control. Every border demanded legions for its defense. Germania, Dacia, Parthia, Britain, and North Africa all required constant military presence. Any withdrawal from a single front would inevitably result in that territory revolting or being overwhelmed by external forces. Rome found itself ensnared in a trap. It could neither afford to sustain its massive military, nor could it afford to reduce it without risking widespread rebellion and territorial loss. Now consider America in 2025 AD. The United States maintains approximately 750 military installations in 80 countries. Its active duty personnel number 1.3 million. Total defense spending officially reported by the Pentagon is $870 billion, supplemented by an additional $300 billion for Veterans Affairs, $50 billion for nuclear weapons programs, $80 billion for intelligence operations, and $50 billion for foreign military aid. The actual annual expenditure thus exceeds $1.5 trillion. This figure represents 54% of the federal discretionary spending. Much like Rome, America finds itself ensnared in a similar predicament. A strategic withdrawal from Europe would embolden Russian expansion. A pullback from Asia would facilitate Chinese encroachment. A retreat from the Middle East would empower Iran to control vital oil resources. The empire in its current state cannot contract without facing imminent collapse. It is the same inescapable trap, the same budgetary percentages, and the same impossibility of retreat. Parallel 2. Currency debasement. In 200 AD, Rome's denarius coin was comprised of 95% silver. By 268 AD, its silver content had plummeted to a mere 5%. This represents a staggering 95% debasement within a span of 68 years. This was a deliberate strategy, as emperors desperately needed funds to pay the military. They were unable to raise taxes without provoking revolts, nor could they implement spending cuts without risking territorial fragmentation. Consequently, they resorted to debasing the currency, minting more coins from the same amount of silver, and using this devalued money to cover expenses. While citizens witnessed a precipitous decline in their purchasing power, America's dollar, as of 1971, still retained its gold backing. However, on August 15, 1971, President Nixon closed the gold window, effectively severing the dollar's link to gold. From 1971 to 2025, the Federal Reserve has created over $20 trillion. The M2 money supply has expanded from $600 billion in 1971 to its current level of $21 trillion. This signifies a 98% erosion of purchasing power over 54 years. The underlying mechanism and the ultimate outcome are identical. The government prints money to finance debts it cannot otherwise manage, leading to a direct transfer of wealth from currency holders to the state. Parallel 3. Wealth inequality. By 300 AD, the concentration of wealth in Rome had reached extreme proportions. The wealthiest 1% controlled an estimated 40% of the nation's total wealth. Senators possessed vast agricultural estates known as latifundia, which were worked by enslaved laborers. The middle class, comprising small-scale farmers and merchants, had been systematically dismantled by rampant inflation and oppressive taxation. The urban poor, meanwhile, became reliant on state-provided handouts and public entertainment. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing around 380 AD, described senators whose annual incomes surpassed 4,000 pounds of gold, while the vast majority of Romans subsisted in abject poverty. In America, in 2025 AD, the wealthiest 1% control 32% of total wealth, and the wealthiest 10% command 67%. The bottom 50%, remarkably, own a mere 2% of the nation's wealth. This wealth disparity has widened dramatically since 1971. In 1971, the top 1% held 25% of wealth. Over 50 years, their share has increased to 32%, while the bottom 50% share has plummeted from 5% to 2%. Median household wealth, when adjusted for inflation, has seen minimal growth since 1971. Conversely, the wealth of billionaires has experienced exponential expansion. In 1982, there were only 13 billionaires in America. By 2025, this number has surged to over 750. The pattern of wealth concentration the erosion of the middle class, and the mechanism of currency debasement transferring wealth upwards are strikingly consistent. Parallel 4. Political dysfunction. By 200 AD, the Roman Senate had become largely ceremonial, with genuine power residing with the emperors, who were often installed or deposed by the military. During the crisis of the 3rd century, from 235 to 284 AD, Rome endured 26 emperors in a mere 49 years, the majority of whom met violent ends through assassination. Civil wars were a perpetual fixture. The government proved incapable of enacting meaningful reforms, as each political faction prioritized its own power over the well-being of the state. In America in 2025 AD, Congress consistently maintains approval ratings below 20%. Legislative gridlock has become the norm, with the last balanced budget enacted in 2001. Every significant reform effort spanning healthcare, immigration, and tax policy has either failed outright or been implemented in a compromised manner and subsequently challenged. Presidents increasingly resort to executive orders, which are then systematically reversed by subsequent administrations. The government is paralyzed, unable to address the escalating debt crisis, the looming entitlement crisis, or the currency crisis, as any viable solution would necessitate political pain that no faction is willing to endure. The result is the same pervasive dysfunction, the same inability to enact reform, and the same prioritization of factional interests over systemic stability. Parallel 5. Bread and circuses. The Roman satirist Juvenal, writing around 100 AD, famously coined the phrase panem et circenses, meaning bread and circuses. The Roman government provided free grain to the urban poor and subsidized gladiatorial contests, chariot races, and theatrical performances. By 380 AD, Rome observed 175 official holidays annually, featuring extensive public entertainment. The Colosseum could accommodate 50,000 spectators, while the Circus Maximus held 250,000. Through this provision of free sustenance and constant entertainment, the Roman government effectively pacified and distracted its populace, thereby sidestepping the need to address pressing systemic issues. In America, in 2025 AD, the average American dedicates 4 hours daily to television viewing. Streaming services, social media platforms, sporting events, and video games offer a ceaseless stream of entertainment. The government provides food assistance to 42 million Americans through programs like SNAP. Student loan forbearance, stimulus checks, and extended unemployment benefits all serve to keep the citizenry placated. The parallel is precise. Free bread has evolved into food stamps, and the circuses of antiquity have transformed into streaming platforms like Netflix. The Roman crowds chanting for gladiators have been replaced by Americans debating which streaming service offers superior content. The populace remains distracted while systemic problems continue to fester and compound. Parallel 6. Declining birth rates and immigration. Rome began to experience a decline in birth rates among its citizen families around 100 AD. The government implemented incentives for procreation, and Emperor Augustus enacted legislation penalizing childless adults. These measures proved largely ineffective. The citizen population dwindled, while the influx of barbarian immigrants increased. By 300 AD, significant portions of the Roman army were comprised of Germanic tribes who were granted citizenship in exchange for military service. This arrangement fostered a considerable loyalty problem. When the Western Roman Empire ultimately fell in 476 AD, the Roman army that failed to defend it was predominantly Germanic. These soldiers lacked any inherent cultural connection to Rome. When Rome could no longer compensate them, they either joined the ranks of the barbarians or established themselves as independent warlords. In America in 2025 AD, the U.S. birth rate stands at 1.6 children per woman, a figure below the replacement rate of 2.1. This trend has been in decline since 1971. Native-born population growth is approaching zero, with all subsequent population expansion attributable to immigration. Projections from the Census Bureau indicate that by 2045, the majority of Americans will be either immigrants themselves or the offspring of immigrants. The military increasingly relies on immigrants who enlist in pursuit of citizenship. While this may not present an immediate crisis, the question remains, should America face an economic downturn and prove incapable of compensating its military personnel, will soldiers whose families have resided in America for a decade fight to preserve an empire that has failed them? Or will their priority shift to their own survival? Rome's experience suggests the latter. The parallel is steadily emerging. Parallel 7. External enemies at the gates. Rome perpetually faced barbarian incursions along all its frontiers. Germanic tribes menaced the north, Goths pressed from the east, Persians occupied Mesopotamia, and Berbers raided from North Africa. Rome engaged these adversaries for 200 years, resulting in a protracted stalemate. The barbarians were incapable of conquering Rome, yet Rome could not eradicate the barbarians. Subsequently, Rome began to weaken internally due to currency debasement, extreme wealth inequality, and political paralysis. The barbarians did not necessarily grow stronger, rather Rome grew weaker. Once Rome could no longer adequately fund its legions, the frontiers began to crumble. In America, in 2025 AD, the nation faces threats from China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and various non-state actors. America has been engaged in maintaining global dominance for 30 years, since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Libya were all attempts to preserve its hegemony. However, none of these endeavors yielded lasting victory. While America has not suffered outright military defeat, it has failed to achieve decisive wins. The cost, however, has been immense. $8 trillion expended on the war on terror, 7,000 American soldiers killed, and hundreds of thousands injured, with the adversaries remaining as formidable as ever. The Taliban now governs Afghanistan, Russia controls Crimea, China is actively constructing artificial islands in the South China Sea, and Iran continues its pursuit of nuclear capabilities. The barbarians are indeed at the gates, not yet overwhelming militarily, but strategically positioned, awaiting an opportune moment of weakness. These 7 parallels collectively lead to the widespread declaration, "We are Rome." And indeed, the comparison is accurate. The parallels are unmistakable. Military overextension, currency debasement, wealth inequality, political dysfunction, the provision of bread and circuses, declining birth rates coupled with immigration, and the presence of external adversaries. Every parallel is precise, and every comparison is valid. However, there is a critical element that is consistently overlooked. While the parallels highlight the possibility of collapse, it is the differences that dictate the timeline and the accelerating nature of the crisis. Let me now elucidate the 5 pivotal distinctions that render America's decline significantly swifter than Rome's. Distinction 1. Technology accelerates everything. Rome operated within a pre-industrial framework. Communication traversed at the speed of a horse, with messages to Britain taking 40 days. Financial transactions necessitated the physical conveyance of gold and silver. Trade progressed at the pace of wind-powered ships and terrestrial transport. This inherent slowness fostered stability through inertia. When Rome debased its currency, it took years for merchants across the empire to perceive the change and adjust their prices accordingly. When a crisis erupted in one province, it took months for its repercussions to permeate other regions. The empire's progression was deliberate, and consequently, its collapse was gradual. In stark contrast, America is a digital nation. Communication is instantaneous. Financial markets operate at the speed of light, with high-frequency trading executing millions of transactions per second. When the Federal Reserve announces a policy change, global markets react within milliseconds. This velocity eradicates inertia. When the Federal Reserve injected $5 trillion into the economy in 2020 and 2021, inflation manifested globally within 18 months. Following the failure of Silicon Valley Bank in March 2023, 3 other banks collapsed within days due to the instantaneous dissemination of information and the rapid nature of digital bank runs. Rome's collapse, spanning 250 years from 235 AD to 476 AD, was a consequence of the slow movement of information and crisis. America's crisis, however, will unfold at digital speed. Instead of 250 years, anticipate a maximum of 25 years from the onset of the crisis to a systemic breakdown. We are already 15 years into this unfolding crisis. The financial collapse of 2008 can be likened to the beginning of Rome's 3rd century crisis in 235 AD. If this accelerated pattern holds true, with technology amplifying the speed tenfold, the American system is projected to experience a breakdown around 2035 to 2040. Distinction 2. Rome could expand. America cannot. When Rome encountered internal challenges, it possessed an escape valve: territorial expansion. By conquering new territories, plundering their wealth, enslaving populations, and appropriating their resources, Rome could buy itself valuable time. Upon becoming emperor in 27 BC, Augustus inherited a Rome reeling from decades of civil war. He partially resolved these issues through expansion, annexing Egypt, which subsequently became Rome's primary breadbasket, and venturing into Germania, albeit with limited success. He stabilized the currency by leveraging Egyptian gold. This expansion granted Rome an additional 200 years of stability. When problems resurfaced around 200 AD, Rome attempted further expansion. Trajan conquered Dacia in 106 AD, seizing its gold mines, and Septimius Severus expanded Rome's influence in North Africa. However, by 250 AD, there were no further territories left to conquer. Rome's borders met those of established empires like Persia, or vast expanses of wastelands and barbarian territories with nothing of value to plunder. Deprived of expansion, Rome lost its vital escape valve. The internal issues of debt, currency debasement, and inequality could no longer be mitigated by the influx of external resources. Consequently, the system was compelled to collapse. America confronts a similar predicament, but it has arrived much sooner. Rome benefited from 500 years of expansion before encountering its limits. America effectively reached its limit in 1945. Following World War II, America exerted dominance over the entire non-communist world. The Marshall Plan, the Bretton Woods Agreement, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund all served as mechanisms for extracting resources from the global system. However, the world is now fully charted. Every territory is claimed, and every resource is being exploited. There are no new frontiers for expansion. The sole remaining avenue has been financialization. Instead of territorial conquest, America has exported dollars and imported goods. The petrodollar system mandated that nations hold dollars, thereby enabling America to print money and shift the ensuing inflation onto the global stage. However, this system is nearing its end. The petrodollar system concluded in June 2024. The BRICS nations are actively developing alternative payment mechanisms. Thus, financial expansion, much like Rome's territorial expansion, has reached its conclusion. Rome experienced 500 years of expansion, followed by 250 years of decline after hitting its territorial limit. America, conversely, enjoyed 50 years of financial expansion from 1971 to 2021, and now faces its own period of decline. The timeline has been compressed by a factor of 5 because America reached its expansionary limit far more rapidly. Distinction 3. Rome's currency debasement was visible. America's is invisible. When Rome debased its denarius, its populace could clearly discern the alteration. A denarius from 200 AD was a substantial silver coin. By 268 AD, it had become a smaller, bronze coin with a mere silver wash. Merchants could physically weigh these coins and test their silver content. The debasement was tangible and evident. This visibility fostered resistance. Merchants began to refuse devalued coins, demanding payment in older currency or in goods. Black markets emerged where transactions were exclusively conducted using silver content coins. The government attempted to legally enforce the acceptance of debased currency, but such enforcement proved impractical across a vast empire with slow communication channels. The conspicuous nature of the debasement imposed a natural limitation on how much the government could devalue its currency. If the silver content was reduced too obviously or too rapidly, the populace would revolt or reject the currency entirely. Rome encountered this critical juncture around 268 AD. Once the denarius became essentially bronze, the government was compelled to slow its rate of debasement. America's currency debasement, however, is imperceptible. Paper dollars appear identical, regardless of whether they were printed in 1971 or 2025. Both possess equal purchasing power. There is no physical distinction. Digital dollars are even more elusive. When the Federal Reserve creates $5 trillion, it manifests as mere digits within a computer system. No citizen directly witnesses this money creation. They experience the inflationary consequences months or even years later, but they fail to establish a connection between the inflation and the act of money creation. This invisibility removes any inherent restraint. The government can generate trillions of dollars without immediate public scrutiny. By the time citizens comprehend the situation through rising inflation, the wealth transfer has already been consummated. Rome was constrained by a level of debasement that its citizens could physically detect. America, however, faces no such constraint. This implies that America can engage in far greater and more rapid currency debasement before a currency crisis ensues. However, when that crisis inevitably strikes, it will be abrupt. Rome's currency depreciated over 250 years. America's currency, however, could collapse within 5 to 10 years once public trust evaporates. Distinction 4. Globalization makes America more fragile than Rome. Rome operated as a largely self-sufficient entity within its own borders. It cultivated food in Egypt, North Africa, and Italy, mined metals in Spain and Dacia, and manufactured goods in its provincial cities. Trade with regions outside the empire, such as China, via the Silk Road or India through maritime routes, primarily involved luxury goods. Rome could endure even if this external trade ceased. Consequently, Rome's economy possessed inherent resilience. If one region faltered, others could compensate. When grain shipments from Egypt were disrupted, North Africa would increase its production. The empire possessed redundancy. America, in contrast, exhibits the opposite characteristic. Globalization has rendered America extraordinarily interdependent. America currently produces only 15% of its manufactured goods, importing the remaining 85%. The annual trade deficit stands at $1.1 trillion. America imports essential materials such as steel, electronics, pharmaceuticals, rare earth minerals, and even basic consumer goods. This creates a condition of catastrophic fragility. Any disruption to global trade immediately precipitates shortages within America. The COVID-19 pandemic offered a stark illustration of this vulnerability, with semiconductor shortages halting automobile production and shipping delays leading to empty store shelves. These were relatively minor disruptions. A more significant crisis, such as a war with China disrupting shipping lanes, or a dollar collapse rendering imports prohibitively expensive, would result in immediate shortages of essential goods. Rome could withstand a 20-year period of crisis using its internal resources. America, however, would confront widespread shortages within months if global supply chains were to break down. This inherent fragility signifies that collapse will occur more rapidly, as the system lacks the resilience to withstand significant shocks. Distinction 5. Rome's elite. Had skin in the game. America's elite have exit plans. Roman senators actively participated in military service. Julius Caesar campaigned in Gaul. Marcus Aurelius fought against Germanic tribes, and Trajan personally led conquests. The Roman elite owned vast estates within the empire, their wealth tied to land that could not be easily moved. If Rome were to fall, they would fall with it. This shared fate, to some extent, provided an incentive to preserve the system. While evidently not sufficient to prevent the ultimate collapse, it was enough to prompt the elite to pursue reforms, such as Diocletian's currency reform and Constantine's administrative restructuring. These efforts ultimately failed, but they were undertaken because the elite were inextricably bound to the Roman system. America's elite, however, possess readily available exit strategies. They hold assets on a global scale, maintain wealth in multiple currencies, and possess dual citizenship. Should America face a crisis, American billionaires can readily transfer their wealth to jurisdictions like Singapore, Dubai, Switzerland, or New Zealand. Their assets are primarily digital and global in nature, rendering them unconstrained by national borders. This lack of entrapment eradicates any imperative to address America's systemic problems. Why bother reforming a system when one can extract maximum wealth and simply depart? The American elite are systematically stripping assets from the American economic framework in a manner analogous to how barbarian warlords plundered Rome, albeit through legal corporate structures and offshore tax havens. The Roman elite also extracted wealth from the empire, but they lacked the means to escape. Consequently, Rome's collapse unfolded over centuries. America's elite, conversely, can depart instantaneously. Therefore, they will extract wealth more rapidly and aggressively, as they have no inherent motivation to preserve anything within the collapsing system. These 5 distinct factors all indicate the same outcome: a significantly hastened societal breakdown. Technological advancements accelerate both the flow of information and the onset of crises. The absence of any viable expansion opportunities eliminates a crucial safety valve. The subtle erosion of value, imperceptible to most, removes inherent natural limitations. Global interconnectedness diminishes inherent resilience, and the existence of escape routes for the privileged class removes any compelling reason for them to enact meaningful reforms. The Roman Empire endured a period of 250 years, spanning from the initial crisis in 235 AD to its eventual demise in 476 AD. America, however, initiated its crisis in 2008. If the observed tenfold acceleration holds true, America could reach a comparable state of collapse by 2033. This represents a mere 11 years from the present. Yet here lies a crucial oversight that most fail to grasp. The comparison to Rome remains valuable, not because our history will mirror theirs precisely, but because Rome exemplifies the inherent mechanisms of imperial disintegration. The devaluation of currency effectively transfers wealth, while excessive military commitments deplete vital resources. Political paralysis prevents necessary reforms, and widespread economic disparity fractures social unity. The provision of superficial comforts, like sustenance and entertainment, merely pacifies rather than resolves underlying issues. Declining birth rates coupled with immigration place strains on societal loyalty. External adversaries are quick to exploit any perceived weakness. These destructive processes are not unique to Rome. They are universal. They manifested in Rome, and they are manifesting in America today. Furthermore, they will inevitably impact any empire that follows. The crucial difference lies in the duration of this decline. Rome's 250-year timeline was a consequence of slow information dissemination and the possibility of outward expansion. The debasement of its currency was overt. Its economy possessed a degree of self-sufficiency, and its ruling class was intrinsically bound to the system. America's timeline, however, is compressed to a mere fraction of that duration due to the instantaneous nature of modern information, the impossibility of further expansion, the invisibility of currency devaluation, the fragility of its globalized economy, and the ability of its elite to disengage. The underlying destructive forces are identical, only the speed of their operation differs. Understanding this compressed timeline is far more critical than dissecting the mechanisms themselves, for it dictates when one must actively prepare. Those anticipating a 250-year Roman-style decline will be utterly unprepared when the American system unravels in the 2030s. They will expect a protracted period of gradual deterioration, only to experience a sudden currency collapse, a breakdown of supply chains, and widespread political unrest, compressed into a span of 5 to 10 years. While the Roman parallel illuminates what to observe, the inherent differences reveal when the crisis will occur. Let me illustrate the specific timeline applying the principles of Roman decline to the accelerated American context. Rome's 3rd century crisis, marked by 26 emperors, relentless currency devaluation, barbarian incursions, plagues, and economic collapse, persisted for 50 years, from 235 AD to 284 AD. Emperor Diocletian subsequently imposed authoritarian reforms, offering a temporary stabilization. America's analogous period commenced in 2008 with the global financial crisis. Applying a tenfold acceleration, Rome's 50-year crisis period shrinks to 5 years. However, America's attempted stabilization came not through reform, but through massive monetary expansion, evidenced by quantitative easing rounds 1, 2, and 3. These actions merely postponed the inevitable without addressing the fundamental issues. The COVID-19 pandemic then struck in 2020. In a mere 2 years, the Federal Reserve injected $5 trillion into the economy. This represents America's equivalent of Emperor Gallienus's reign. Gallienus drastically debased the denarius, reducing its silver content from 40% to a mere 5% over a 15-year span, from 253 AD to 268 AD. In contrast, the Federal Reserve devalued the dollar by 20% in purchasing power within just 2 years, from 2020 to 2022. What followed Gallienus's reign in Rome? 5 years of peak crisis, from 268 AD to 273 AD. The empire fractured, with the Gallic Empire and the Palmyrene Empire seceding. The Roman Empire was reduced to Italy. Emperor Aurelian eventually reconquered these territories, achieving a temporary resurgence. If this pattern continues with the tenfold acceleration, the period between 2022 and 2027 should witness a maximum crisis. Widespread banking failures, severe currency stress, political disintegration, and potentially state-level defiance of federal authority. This will be followed by a temporary stabilization from 2027 to 2028, achieved through authoritarian measures, including expanded federal control, the implementation of a central bank digital currency, and capital controls. This is America's Aurelian moment. What happens next? In Rome, Aurelian's stabilization lasted 14 years, culminating in Diocletian's reforms in 284 AD. Diocletian's reforms endured for 20 years, and Emperor Constantine's subsequent reforms lasted another 30 years. Rome experienced a period of stabilization from 284 AD to 337 AD, characterized by authoritarian governance, price controls, currency revaluation, and administrative restructuring. Nevertheless, the Western Roman Empire ultimately fell in 476 AD. These reforms merely bought time, failing to resolve the fundamental underlying problems. The Eastern Roman Empire survived by strategically minimizing its losses, abandoning the West, concentrating its defenses on Anatolia and Egypt, and persisting for another 1,000 years. If America follows this trajectory with the tenfold acceleration, the provisional stabilization from 2027 to 2028 would extend until 2032 or 2033, a period of roughly 5 to 6 years. Subsequently, the reform system would falter because the proposed solutions are mathematically incapable of addressing the overwhelming debt. At that juncture, between 2033 and 2035, America would confront a decision analogous to Constantine's. Constantine relocated the capital to Constantinople in 330 AD, effectively ceding the West to preserve the East. Will America likewise abandon a portion of its influence to safeguard its core? Will it withdraw from Europe and Asia to concentrate on defending its homeland? Or will it fracture into regional power blocks? Rome's decline from the initial crisis in 235 AD to the fall of the Western Empire in 476 AD spanned a total of 241 years. With a tenfold acceleration, America's path from the crisis's inception in 2008 to its completion would take a mere 24 years, placing the state of collapse in the year 2032. However, fall does not equate to a post-apocalyptic scenario. The Roman Empire in 476 AD did not vanish. It fragmented. The Eastern Roman Empire endured, and regional kingdoms emerged. Life continued, albeit with diminished living standards, reduced trade, and localized governance. America's decline will likely resemble this scenario. a weakening of federal authority, states asserting greater control, the dollar losing its status as the global reserve currency but persisting domestically, a reduction in international trade, and a decline in living standards. This is not an apocalypse, but rather a transition akin to Argentina's economic struggles or Russia's post-Soviet turmoil, where formerly prosperous nations experience rapid impoverishment. The Roman comparison, adjusted for the 5 accelerating factors, suggests America will enter an acute crisis phase between 2025 and 2027, followed by a temporary authoritarian stabilization from 2027 to 2032, and a systemic collapse between 2032 and 2035. This compressed timeline is a mere 10 years of maximum crisis, not 250. The underlying mechanisms will mirror Rome's: currency crises, bank failures, supply chain disruptions, political breakdown, regional fragmentation, and external adversaries exploiting vulnerabilities, all compressed into a single decade instead of centuries. Now let us consider the actionable implications of this information. The Roman parallel confirms that collapse is not merely a possibility, but a mathematical certainty, given the unsustainable debt levels, rampant currency debasement, and excessive military commitments. The inherent differences, however, indicate a timeline of 10 to 20 years, not 200, thereby imbuing a sense of urgency. With a 200-year outlook, one might afford to wait and observe. However, with a 10 to 20-year window, immediate action is imperative. Preparing for a Roman-style collapse within an accelerated time frame necessitates understanding what endured in Rome, what survived. Tangible assets such as land, structures, commodities, practical skills, and localized networks. What did not survive? Fiat currency, government bonds, urban wealth contingent on trade, pensions, and savings denominated in devalued currencies. The same principles will apply to America, albeit with contemporary equivalents. What will endure? Real assets including real estate in strategically advantageous locations, commodities, practical skills, and resilient communities. What will not endure? Dollar-denominated savings, treasury bonds, retirement accounts like 401ks, and financial assets or pensions that depend on the stability of the federal government or global trade. The Roman comparison reveals the destructive mechanisms, while the differences highlight the accelerated timeline. Together they offer a roadmap for strategic preparation. Rome also teaches that its elite class survived by possessing hard assets and maintaining geographical mobility. Roman senators who owned estates in stable provinces, such as North Africa or the Eastern Territories, thrived within the Eastern Empire. Conversely, senators whose wealth was concentrated in Italy and depended on Rome itself were ruined when the empire fell. America's elite are already in a comparable position. They possess global assets, multiple citizenships, offshore accounts, international real estate holdings, and reside in stable countries. They are emulating the prudent actions of their Roman counterparts by diversifying geographically and prioritizing hard assets. The middle class, however, is mirroring the Roman plebeian class by holding onto currency and government promises. The Roman middle class clung to debased denarii, trusting in the government's ability to rectify the situation. Similarly, the American middle class holds dollars and retirement funds, placing their faith in the government's capacity to preserve the existing system. Both, however, are fundamentally mistaken. The Roman middle class was decimated. The American middle class is currently being eroded through inflation and asset appreciation that disproportionately benefits those who already possess wealth. If your preparations do not align with those of the Roman elite, you are positioned akin to the Roman plebeians, and history clearly demonstrates their fate. The Roman comparison is not an exercise in pessimism. It is an application of pattern recognition. Empires grappling with insurmountable debt, overextended military commitments, and profound political dysfunction inevitably collapse. The duration of this decline varies based on technological advancement, opportunities for expansion, the transparency of currency value, economic resilience, and the incentives available to the ruling class. Rome experienced a protracted collapse because all 5 factors contributed to inertia. America, conversely, is facing a rapid collapse as these same 5 factors create an accelerative force. Nevertheless, the outcome remains consistent: currency crises, economic contraction, political fragmentation, diminished living standards, and regional disintegration. The American empire is following the Roman playbook, albeit at an accelerated pace. The next 10 years will witness the unfolding of events that Rome experienced over 250 years. The underlying mechanisms are identical. The timeline is drastically compressed. The ultimate outcome is foreseeable. Unlike the Roman era, where historians can debate the inevitability of its fall, we possess mathematical certainty. The national debt stands at $36 trillion and continues to rise. Interest payments alone approach $900 billion annually and are increasing. The currency is being systematically devalued, the military is overextended, political dysfunction is rampant, wealth inequality is extreme, the birth rate has fallen below replacement levels, and adversaries are strategically positioned. Every parallel that existed for Rome in 235 AD is present for America in 2025 AD. However, America faces these challenges with greater intensity and the added burden of accelerative factors. Rome's decline took 250 years. America's will not take 25. If this analysis has illuminated the accuracy of the Roman comparison while simultaneously demonstrating how most misinterpret the timeline, and if you understand that the accelerating differences propel collapse rather than prevent it, and if you recognize that 2032 to 2035 represents the probable completion of the crisis based on Roman mechanisms and American acceleration, then subscribe. The next installment will explore other empires that followed this precise pattern at varying speeds. Spain experienced a 150-year decline, and Britain's followed a 100-year trajectory. Each empire's timeline was dictated by its technological capabilities, its expansionist policies, and the mobility of its elite. Understanding the variables that govern the timeline is paramount to discerning when to act versus when it is already too late. Rome teaches us the mechanisms of collapse, while the inherent differences in our current situation reveal the compressed timeline. Together, these insights demonstrate that we are living through an imperial collapse compressed into a single generation. 10 years from now, America will be as profoundly different from today as Rome in 476 AD was from Rome in 235 AD. It will remain the same country in name, but a fundamentally altered reality on the ground. Welcome to the era of accelerated Roman collapse.